Yeah, I guess that's a good point, right? Talking about going back to the roots and it being both about karting's history and vintage karting just as much as it is about club karting. Yeah, the first ever paid commentary gig I ever had was the Barnesville Vintage Winter Nats in
Yeah.
it would have been I think it would have been 2013. I don't know if it was 2013 or 20 no. Let me all confused here now. Let's see. We did Clone Junior in 2012. Got our first go-kart in the summer, and then I think it would have been the 2013 Winter Nats. I got paid $75, and I think that was eating up about half of it, probably $30 of it in
Yeah.
gas down there and back. Barnesville was like an hour 45 from my house.
Yeah. So you came to, I believe, the very first USPKS race, and I was Mark's announcer. And you raced that race, and your dad brought you up, and here's this little kid. And he said, "Hey, my son's an announcer. Could he announce some of the races?" I said, "Look, you got to go talk to Mark. I can't make that call." So I kind of blew you off, and now I look like an idiot, right? So, but
Yeah.
I remember that, and then I think the next vintage year, maybe the next year at the vintage, I got a couple good friends, Rick Chapman and Dean Souter from Ohio here, and they're really heavy into vintage racing. So they go to Barnesville every year. I said, "Man, there's this kid doing the announcing. He's really good." I said, "I know exactly who he is. That's Xander Clements." I says, he's his voice is incredible, and he's got a passion for karting. So obviously, here you are. It's 10 years ago, and you're still a young man, but you've got a lot of miles on the road so far. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, I think we were 1 year later. We were the second season of USPKS when we came to that first
Okay.
race. 20 I know exactly the weekend. I don't remember. That's funny. I don't see this is why like I'm so excited to do this show is to get to talk to people and go over
Yeah.
old war stories because
Yeah.
I had no idea my dad had come up and talked to you about that. But I
Yeah.
know that yeah, around that time you were far from the only one to snub me. I had
Yeah.
kind of begged and pulled on everyone's,
Hey,
coattails to do anything.
right.
But like at 14, 15-year-old kid, I think I would have been 15. We I don't know what broke. We broke down on the way to that race,
Oh yeah.
and yeah, because my parents still have this because we've uh, this vehicle actually looking back probably should have been like more on the notes that was going to break down a lot. But it's a '94 Jeep Grand Cherokee hardtop, um, and later that year when I got my big announcing break, it broke down when I was by myself. But at this point, my dad and I were using it to tow our 7x12 little trailer. We got about an hour and a half up the road on the 5-hour drive from Georgia to Mooresville. Broke down right near my uncle's place. We spent the night there. And at the time, there wasn't Thursday practice, there was just Friday. By the time we made it to the track, got the cart out, got everything all ready to go. I think we made only the last two practice sessions. So, but we ran really, really good that weekend. I crashed in one of the days, drove back to ninth. The other day we qualified fifth on one of the Dismore's rocket ships Yamahas because I blew the chain off of it and blew the motor when I got ran over and the chain came off, not thinking anything, just going, yeah, and there was no chain on the motor and revved a Yamaha to Timbuktu and blew it up. But I remember that one. Yeah, we missed out on a ton of practice, and I'll never forget too one of the core memories from that weekend. That was my first time ever running on MG tires because the only other racing I had done to that point was Bridgestones with WK Kart Week the year before in December because this was around April when it was USPKS's opener, and then club stuff at Barnesville, which was also on YLCs. And at the time, Yamaha Junior was MG Yellows for whatever reason. So we were just stuck, and there was just so much. I just remember feeling like, wow, like you can just do anything you want to and like barely touch the
Yeah.
brakes. You're just on the gas. So that's funny. Yeah, I
Yeah.
had no idea my dad came up to you on that weekend.
Oh yeah. So it's like mid 1960s, and we had our own go kart track, Port Washington. It was Kugler Raceway Park. We had some national events there, WK Nationals, and in the '60s we had some IKO Spring Nationals there. It was back in the day, it was about a half-mile track, but it was one of the more well-known tracks, certainly east of the Mississippi. And I was planning on racing that night, And my dad comes up to me at about, I don't know, 6 o'clock. I'd already been out to practice once. And he goes, "You're not racing tonight." So what do you mean I'm not racing tonight? He says, "Paul," which was our announcer, Paul Favreau, "Paul can't make it." "What's that got to do with me?" He says, "Well, you're announcing tonight." I said, "I don't know how to announce." He said, "So you better learn fast because you're announcing tonight." So that was my first announcing gig. And I was nervous as heck, but I always had the gift of gab. So I did it. People were going, "Oh, you did a great job." And then Paul came back, "Hey, you're trying to steal." He's joking, but I said, "No, man, you're the announcer." But that kind of evolved. And at bigger events, I would help out. But that's always been something I've enjoyed because and you know this with Kart Chaser and just your announcing days, if you can bring the race to the families and the people at the fence and the friends and the crews, and they enjoy it, and you hear them listening to you, and they're getting more out of the race than just watching it, you've done your job. And there's some gratification there as an announcer to say, "You know what? I gave them an experience today, and I had fun doing it." So I think we both share that passion for the sport in doing that. So that's kind of cool. But I'm excited about this show because I've been saying for a long time that I left WK in 2007, so it's gone on 20 years. About 18 years I've been gone from the day-to-day life of karting, but I was pretty involved with USPKS for a number of years, and commend Mark on the great job he's doing. But I still feel like there's somewhat of a void for the club racer. I know Joe Janowski and NK is doing some things at the grassroots level to help educate clubs and tracks on how to build a business plan and how to run a successful club, and that's good. That's needed. And I think through this show, you and I can bring some of those success stories, I'd like to think, into the spotlight to share some ideas. And I'm not going to mention names, but you know who they are, and we'll reach out to them. But there's certainly some tracks throughout the country that have, pardon the pun, a track record of getting large turnouts, consistency, a rule structure, great awards program, gratification at the end of the year with a killer banquet. We need to know their secrets so we can get people that are struggling or people that are starting a club or building a track. They can listen in and say, "Geez, that's a good idea. You know what? I'll call that guy. He left me his number. I'll give him a call." So I think that's one of the things I want to accomplish, and I know we've shared that idea many times with this show is to kind of bring that to the forefront and talk about some of those success stories about the clubs, and some aren't clubs, some are just track owners that run a good solid program.
Yeah, well, so that's I think what's going to be so fun to dive into throughout this show, especially going across the country. Our country is so regionalized, and for the better half of the 70 years of this sport's existence, has been run without an overarching sanctioning body. So everyone's kind of who's been able to be successful, whether it's been a kart shop or a race team or just in general business, along with team or club or series, they've all kind of paved their own way and built their fleshed out their own model. And I think for me, one of the things that was um, and still is a big priority of what I'd like to do, is that we don't need to reinvent the wheel because there's probably 25 different wheels in the country that are all spinning and working really, really well. And I think taking that analogy and actually applying it, for example, when I was down at Homestead, most people don't know a ton of my background. I've told it a couple times, but I worked at Atlanta Motorsports Park. That was my first job when I was 16 and 17 years old, from just corner marshal to work in the pit lane for rental carts and club races, and then helping run the club series and some of their intro to karting schools, and even did like rental cart testing in the latter half of the days and help manage the leagues and the race series and even the Spec Miata series they have on the kart track. But I also spent 3 years after that, while I was finishing college, working for Eric Jones and Darren Tebby down at Homestead. And Darren's still down there. And one of the smartest things that I think that track did, that I'm surprised that a place like Barnesville or maybe some of the other tracks like a 103rd Street may not be the prime example, um, but tracks that are maybe on the lower end of budget, uh, but have a decent, healthy club or the inklings of one, is getting in a bunch of shipping containers and hollowing them out and turning them into garages. And I've seen it if you look closely at certain venues, and more tracks are kind of leveraging the, ease of use and lack of permitting needed for a personal container, which is how those shipping containers are used. But I mean, it was fantastic down there. It still is fantastic. I mean, it's like the whole row of the first layer of the pit area on both sides now is almost completely full, and I think they could probably fill an entire another row of it. And all it was around probably, I'm not sure what the pricing was at the time. I think it's probably different now from when we got them pre-COVID, but to at least finish them out, like if we really wanted to put a drop ceiling in, put some insulation, put some lighting, I think all that's been done to them and some of the other tracks is just put like power outlets in. But you right off the bat eliminate a huge barrier to entry, and that's the need to not just get a trailer, but in my family's sake, for example, our tow vehicle was struggling when we were trying to tow a 7x12 trailer. So you take that out, and now for a couple $100 a month, the price of a storage unit, you can keep your cart at the track, and I think that's heavily understated. But you can see how much of a success that would be probably at any venue just by the rise of teams and full service arrive and drive programs all the way at the club level, which is a whole different conversation with its own pros and cons. But in the modern, in 2025, a lot of apartment complexes, buying a house is really tough. Not everybody's got a garage to come home to, even those in their 30s and 40s and families. And, probably the most untapped market is like my age group, this 25 to 35-year-old. It's probably the smallest demo actively in karting. And I think speaking for a lot of us, I mean, I'm from a 2-bedroom apartment right now with my roommate in the room next door, right? I don't have a garage, so I wouldn't be able to participate in the sport if I had to have a truck and a trailer. And seeing those go in, and only ever seeing at like a place like GoPro, just beautiful, super nice 6-figure garage buildings going, you're thinking, oh, not every track can have that. But just some out of the box thinking that I'm sure a lot of other clubs do and a lot of other kart shops do, that they've done just to survive because they've needed to, for someone to maybe listen to the show or get connected to that person and go, wow, never even thought of that. And that's an ingenious idea that could grow their program back at home. That was just one example that it blew me away. You just like, it's not a crazy concept, I guess, to take a container and hollow it out, right? But it's not done by every single facility.
No, and that's certainly more cost effective. My experience, I've been to Newcastle a lot, and they've got permanent structures there, but the concept is the same, and they reach the same objective, and that is that you can drive up in your street car because everything you need is in your garage, and you go up there and on a Wednesday night just to get some track time. It's all there. It's convenient, and you're right. You don't need a tow rig. You don't need a trailer. If all you're going to do is club racing, which there's nothing wrong with that. Camden had their opener this past weekend, the Ohio Valley Karting Association. They had a picture on their Facebook of the start in, I think, maybe 206, one of the senior classes. They must have had 25 to 30 karts in their feature event. I mean, they had a ton of people down there. One of the things that I think is helpful is if you have a club that doesn't necessarily own the track, but there's a track owner that has a passion for karting, and so they work in harmony, so to speak. You've got that at Newcastle, you've got it at Camden at the OVK with the Gregg family. You had it at Whiteland with Sarah Fisher and her husband. Now K1's taken over, but from the sounds of it, they're full speed ahead. I think you need both those things. Sometimes if you have a club that has to run everything, that's a big commitment for someone to volunteer themselves for. But if you've got an owner that makes sure the facility's provided and the club to make sure that the racers come and there's a structure and the races are conducted properly, it's a good match. And I think those are a lot of the success stories, is because you got those two pieces of the puzzle that come together.
And when we say back to the roots too, the double-edged part of it, the second meaning is the sports roots. And Randy, I called you originally back, when we were, from where we're recording this show to our first phone call talking about wanting to do this, it's been almost 5 months, right? And it's not because it took forever for me to get your headset sent to you or for you to be able to learn how to plug it in.
That took 4
But
months.
no, a lot of it's been me. But I wanted to talk to you, especially coming off the end of last year. And there was, a lot of growth. Our sports benefited a ton off of F1 towing the line for road course motorsports, I think altogether. Being a sport that was able to be one of the first activities for people to get into after the pandemic was huge. And across the board, everyone here in the US has been pretty good about trying to toe the line collectively and not work too much against each other. We've had stability with engines, stability with tires, stability with the same even series promoters, um, all of them lasting for a long, long time now. Um, but there still are a bunch of, problems if you want to look for them or opportunities for growth. And it kind of dawned on me. I was like, well, I feel like some of these situations have probably been encountered before. Um, whether it be cart counts or um, race weekend formats to officiating styles to a number of, all the same concepts in the same way of I just don't know what I don't know by, being a track far away from another track that's doing something else. The same way here in the modern era, there's only so much of the history of the sport that's been connected. And so when I thought to call you, I was like, well, there's one family that thankfully I have on my phone that's got a lineage about tied to the hip as you can, and that's you and the Kugler family, your dad's legacy. So I wanted to also in our opening episode ask you what is like one of the first memories you can think of karting altogether. If you go all the way back, what's the first memory or spot that comes to mind?
I was first introduced to karting, I think it was 1959. I would have been 5 years old. And they were racing track rabbits. They had a roll cage, seat belts. They were the first step to a go-kart. And I'd never driven one, but my brother raced. And at the end of the day, he said, "You want to take it out for a run?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, sure." So he puts me in the cart and he put the big hoop for the steering, and he put my legs inside the hoop because I wasn't big enough to go outside where, adults would wrap around the hoop. So I didn't even check to see if I could reach the brake, but I just took off and I made a few laps and I did okay. And I come in the pits and, I don't know if there was a fence anywhere in the place, let alone a secure pit area. And I went to reach for the brake and I couldn't reach it. So I made another lap and I had the presence of mind to slow down a little bit. And I think my brother reached up and grabbed the back of the cart and I might have drug him a little bit, but we got it stopped. That's my first memory. But one of my most vivid memories was, again, probably late 60s at our track. And my dad was a big hunter. He liked deer hunting. He went to Canada moose hunting. That was a big thing. And I had raced for 4 or 5 years, had some success, uh, and never had raced anywhere unless my mom and dad were with me. So my dad's going moose hunting. So that weekend we've got a race. He's not going to be there. So I'm a big boy now. I don't need my dad there. I can race. He said, "It's up to you, man. You want to race? Go ahead." It's okay. So I go out and I'm about, mid pack in the junior race. And there's probably 15, 20 in the class. And I'm working my way through the field. And I come around a corner and a kid had spun out and I hit him head on, launching me out of the cart. I don't know how, but instinctively I barrel rolled and just scratched my hand. I had a little blood on my hand. That was it. But my cart, it jammed the throttle. And when it did, it spun it around and it's now Atkins Raceway, but we had a big Monza turn.
Yeah.
And that cart took off wide open across the whole racetrack, up over the Monza and into the woods.
Like a ramp.
Like a ramp. Yeah, launched it like Evel Knievel style into the woods. So I had a couple buddies in the race, and they're checking me out. "You okay? Hey, where's my?" And I'm freaking out. "Where's my cart? Where's my cart?" And they go, "Oh, we'll go get it." So they're walking me back to the pits, making sure I'm all right. They bring my cart back, and I'm telling you, the highest part of the cart wasn't a foot high. It was leveled. I had a like a K77 or something, Sidewinder, Lancer Sidewinder. It was laying flat. It was just destroyed. The first thing that came to my mind was, uh-oh, I got to
Yeah.
tell my dad. So, of course, my dad's still in Canada looking for moose. So my mom comes up, you okay? I say, yeah, I'm fine. I'm fine. So I'm talking to her. I go, listen, Mom, you got to tell Dad. She goes, oh, no. No, 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 no. You're telling your dad. I said, really? She goes, yeah. So later on the next week, Dad gets back from hunting, and we're at the track. And by the way, Mom had already told him, but I wasn't smart enough to figure that out. So I said, hey, I got to show you something. Let's walk down to the shop. So we're walking down there. I open the door, and here's my sprint cart that I converted to a lay down enduro in one simple accident. And he had a few expletives, but basically is, what in the world did you do? I said, look, it wasn't my fault. I said, I was mid-pack. I was coming around a corner. Bobby spun out, and I hit him head on. I couldn't help it. And I swear, just on cue, he looked at me and he said, I'm going to tell you something. You got to stop looking right under your nose when you drive. You got to look ahead. You got to know what's coming to you. He said, if you just look under your nose, you're going to hit everything and you'll never know where you're going. He says, you got to be looking ahead. You should already know what's in front of you. And I'll never forget that. And honestly, I took those words and it just transitioned almost everything I've done in my life. It's like, yeah, today kind of sucked, but you know what? We got some stuff going on down the road. Keep moving forward. Keep looking ahead. So that's probably my most vivid memory of racing.
What a story. That's so crazy. So, how far along do you remember, like, the process of how quick your dad built your guys' racetrack? What was that like? What's the first memories you can think of him going, yeah, all right, honey, we're building a go-kart track?
My dad didn't like to be anybody to dare him. And this dirt track in our local community was where my brother raced. And my dad and the fellow that was running the track got in this big argument one day about something. And to tell you the truth, I don't know who was right or wrong. I was just a kid, but I know that they didn't agree. That's for sure. And the gentleman said to my dad, if you know so much, Kugler, just go build your own so-and-so track. He says, all right, I will. So he left there and everybody's kind of laughing. Well, again, you didn't challenge my dad. You didn't dare him. So he found some property right across the street in Port Washington, Ohio, from where he was born. Like there was a house up on the hill, and that's where he lived as a kid. And he had this vision of a racetrack. And back then it was a quarter mile, which was the standard. Initially, it was built very similar to a track in Fremont, Ohio, which still exists and still has the layout of our track. But over the years, we expanded on it. But he started in 61, I believe, building it. And he knew a guy that did the excavating. He had French drains, so the track would always drain. He knew an asphalt guy. He had a guy for everything. And he put some money into it. And we launched the season in 1962. So it was a year in the making. And in 1962, and it was like the field of dreams, man. He built it, and people came, and we I tell people we never had a club there till the day we sold it. However, there was such a community of people that would come down there, and you'd have to know my mom, but she made sure that everybody was family. And so, although we didn't have a club, we had everybody helping out. And I know my dad would help out with entry fees or whatever. I need somebody at the scales this week or the grid. And it just always worked out. But a lot of fond memories there. But my dad got older, and I was getting involved. I was raising a family, so he found a buyer in '77, and we sold it. And there's some days I wish we hadn't, but unfortunately it's landlocked. So with the size of the tracks, it's a great track for vintage, but the size of the tracks today, you could never go high end and run any type of a national level a race there. Even cup carts probably would be too small. Maybe not, but it would be tough. It's about 0.4 of a mile, I think, now.
That's the coolest story, though, for it to be just right down the road from where. Isn't that like something out of a movie script? Like a kid grows up loves racing, loves motorsports, and says, I mean, that it brings you back to the movie Up, like there's just always this dream, and then
Yeah.
here's your dad. He finds this plot of land just right down from where he grew. That's so cool.
So he buys the property, and when you pull into Atkins, like it's called Bunker Hill Road. You go down and you turn left and go through the gate, and you drive up this road, and it's parallel to this property to the right, and the racetrack is to the left. Well, up on the hill, he didn't own that. When he bought it, he didn't buy that property, but he had a vision of a campground. So he looked through the court records. He found out who owned it. He reached out to this lady in, I don't know, Northwest Ohio or something, told her what he was doing, what he wanted to do. She had him sign some sort of a release, and he leased it from her for not very much. And he put roads in, he put in electrical outlets. It was a natural spring coming off the hill. There was like Lancer Lane and West Bend Avenue and McCullough Drive, things like that. They had like 4 or 5 drives, and people would come down there and camp and race while they were there, basically. But it was a real family atmosphere, and I kind of miss that in karting now, because and nothing against what you have now. It's just gotten so developed and so high end, so to speak, and so sophisticated. I know there's still some camaraderie and fellowship, but it gets pretty serious.
It does. I think there's so many factors that, I mean, we can go down a whole rabbit hole, right? I mean, like, you know, my introduction to technically karting is the same as a lot of kids, and that's through indoor karting leagues. Before, because my parents were intimidated, by the outdoor karting scene, and that was not knowing at all of what it was like. To display to you our ignorance. Growing up in Georgia. Granted, my dad's a Hoosier, but it's NASCAR country. We were NASCAR fans. We still are NASCAR fans. It's the only fantasy league that I still try to stay a part of. And I'm terrible at it. First of all, I'm terrible when I get my picks in. I'm also terrible at submitting my picks on time, because I usually forget when we're at a race weekend. My dad's really good about reminding me, as are my siblings. But our family fantasy league in NASCAR is the only fantasy league I tell people don't even bother inviting me most of the time, because I'm going to forget. But we were NASCAR fans, and that growing up, huge Jeff Gordon, Hendrick Motorsports, Jimmy Johnson, and everything. And there's at least I think around 10 dirt oval go-kart tracks in Georgia. There's a couple of dirt car tracks right down the road from us in Woodstock, Georgia, is Dixie Speedway. I mean, that was 15 minutes from my house. But there's only one sprint karting track. Now there's two with AMP. But at the time there was only Barnesville, and the only reason we went sprint karting and road course karting, beyond the fact that was what was the layout of the indoor track that we would do the rental leagues at, was because we figured if we knew nothing and our go kart was going to be not set up well and not put together well, that maybe turning left and right. I could make up for the difference a little bit more than on ovals. Had no idea about the tire game in dirt karting at the time. But also had no idea, about anything when it came to wrenching on go-karts. And even still, the modern age, I think the community was a lot stronger and more welcoming than what we thought from the outside going in. And it's hard now, even just only 10, I guess now about 12 to 14 years removed from that time, of trying to put myself back in the shoes of someone from the outside looking in, and um, yeah, like the downside to the how elevated and how cool our national events are now, is how intimidating they probably are to
Oh
even
yeah,
people that are in the sport.
and I think the modernization of karting, right? So
Yeah.
back when I raced, Goodyear Blue Streaks, hard as concrete. You put them. You got a new set at the and you hear people say that, you think they're joking. They're serious. New set at the beginning of the year. At the end of the year, you got a new set again, just because because they really weren't worn out. We were in Carlisle's. They were hard compound. Then we went to Barnesville one year, 1979, and a truck pulled in with Continental tires, and that's when the tire revolution started. They pulled in, opened up the trailer. They got soft compound Continentals. Well, there's no tire rule because it was never an issue. Well, those tires on Barnesville were about a second on average. Everybody had to get them. Well, then it was just wide open. Everybody had to have a soft compound. You had to get the Continentals, then Bridgestone come in, Dunlop, and so on. So that added an element of an expense that we didn't have before, because it was just straight up, Goodyear, Blue Streaks. Maybe somebody might run some Carlisles, but they were never, nobody ever went back and forth saying the Carlisles are faster on this track than that track or whatever. It was just that simple. So you bought a set of tires for, 30 or 40 bucks and check it off the list. I don't need to worry about that anymore. That's one thing that's really changed, obviously. And then, I think engine wise, you would go a few races back then on a McCalla. If you could rebuild them, but you could go a few races if you didn't blow it up or stick it without having to rebuild anything, change the spark plug and keep on going, And I think because the knowledge gained over the years, the sophistication of, obviously the computerization, so to speak, of what they learn from the engines and the RPMs and so on, that all changes. And the spirit of competition, everybody wants to go faster. In order to do that, well, then you got to get the next best thing. And it's where I think it's fascinating to look at the vintage karting guys, because for the most part, they're still living the dream of back in the day. And to me, that's still pretty cool.
Quick question, Randy. I'm gonna clip this really quick. Is your screen frozen? Am I frozen for you or you for me?
No. Mm-mm.
You're good? Okay.
Yeah. No.
I think
You
I
froze
may.
once, but it stopped. I mean, it kept going.
Okay, cool. Yeah, because for right now you're frozen for me, but I couldn't tell if it was my end or your end, which means that the local recording, if you're still seeing yourself moving on screen, I'm gonna pop out and pop in. I think it'll still keep recording because I'm
Okay.
refreshed real quick. Now I don't see you at all, but I don't know. I don't think it's
Now
you.
you're
It's
froze.
definitely gotta be.
Yeah, you're
Yeah.
choppy now.
Let's see. There we go. All right.
Okay.
Back in.
All right.
Let's see. Is this our? Yeah, that one's ours. Okay. Because all right. So when that happens in would you say 79, at that point, you're somewhat involved. WK's been around for a short bit, right?
About 6 or 7 years. Yeah.
So is there conversations that happen going, hey, we need to put an axe to this now? Was that ever brought up in like a board meeting, or
I
where would
I
this
think
go with this Continental truck and these softer tires coming out?
I think it kind of blindsided a lot of people. And we all wanted to go faster. I was racing back then. I was racing Reed Heavy. And it I mean, you had to get the tires. You had to get out there and do it because everybody you were chasing was on those tires. And I think to some extent they felt like the horse was out of the barn then, and it was nationwide. I mean, it was happening on the West Coast as well. What I think people didn't expect maybe was the tire wars, and that's where the spec tire evolved. Because okay, fine, we got to buy Continental tires. They don't have the life they did have. The Goodyears had. It's going to cost a little more, but that's fine. We're going faster. It's it's a competitive sport. Well, then Bridgestone gets into the picture, and Bridgestone became very supportive of karting on both ends, both IKF and WKA. And so they're in the mix now, and they've got a pretty good tire, but it maybe isn't as fast at Jacksonville as it is at Barnesville, or vice versa. And all of a sudden, then you got to decide which tire works best at what pressures. So it added a lot of variables you didn't have before, and choices and expenses, and that's those are just bits and pieces, but those are little things that started to escalate to where karting from an expense standpoint is where it is today. And you don't quite have that. To some degree, you do, because they don't have the hard tires in vintage. They're still running softer tires, but you don't have that in vintage because for the most part, it's still the old stuff with the old chassis, guys out racing, but at the same time, shaking hands and telling war stories after it's over.
Yeah, I mean, it was always more of a showcase than a race whenever I would be there for the vintage races, and I think, yeah, that probably keeps those guys from buying up pallets and pallets of tires. But
I
um,
I got to tell you um, a vintage story. I
yeah,
was at Newcastle a few years ago, and you know Mike Geeson.
yeah,
Okay, one of the top tuners in in the high end karting. But Mike is a multi champion WK Triple Crown winner. The kid just lived and breathed racing from
oh yeah,
about
he's a
2 years
wheel man.
old. Yeah, he's a wheel man. So I'm there watching the C Opens, and on the front row is Lake Speed and Mike Geeson. So I'm watching this race, and they're going at it, man. And they're nose to tail for like 8 laps, and they come in, and Lake's huffing and puffing, and Mike takes his helmet off. He's grinning from ear to ear, and they're hugging each other. So they get past it, and I'm, congratulating Lake, and I walk up to Mike. I said, I had no idea you're racing this. He goes, Randy, that is some of the most fun I've ever had in my life. Not just driving the C Open, but chasing Lake Speed. And the other thing he said, which I thought was kind of funny, he said, how in the world did they drive these carts back then? You didn't have, I mean, this was a, pretty stiff chassis with not a lot of options on what to change to make it handle better.
Yeah, yeah, like the carts are heavier now, but between softer tires and just general chassis setup
And
evolution, they I mean, Lynn Haddock talks about it. He's like, they're slot cars now,
yeah,
and that's like no one really gets it until you get behind the wheel of like a C Open or any of the really fast twin engine packages that are around from the 70s and 80s and 90s. You go, holy crap, like, yeah, this top speed might be plus or minus 10 miles an hour off of, a shifter or something in the modern era, but these things are out of control,
yeah.
when you get down into the corner.
And Lynn Haddock's a good example. My first my first trophy at Barnesville was 67. I got 5th in modified junior, I think. Lynn won his first Barnesville in 67. He won a couple of classes. And so, I started following him then, and all the things he did. And it was always single engine. In 73, we had the WK Sprint Nationals. And it was one of the first years he was running C Open. And there was a guy that raced at our track all the time, and he was one of the best C Open drivers in the country, Ken Burden. And that was his home track. And nobody was going to beat Ken Burden. And Lynn came down and beat Ken Burden. It was unbelievable. And those guys went at it. I mean, just, right on each other for the entire race, never touched each other. And Lynn told me this last year after the race. He said, Ken come up to me and said, you know what? I think it's time. And Lynn's going, time for what? He says, it's time for me to hand you the keys because, you young guys are taking over and I need to step down. So that was kind of an evolution there. But I mean, there's so many stories. I told you I've been talking to Ron Emick and Tim Meyer about the Go-Kart Hall of Fame and the Emick reunion that's coming up in a couple weeks. I remember a story. It would have been 69 at Camden, the IKF Nationals. 63 karts in Reed Jr. I qualified third. I finished third. I finished ahead of Kyle Atkins. That's one of my few shining moments. I beat Kyle Atkins. Not too many people can say that, right? But in B Limited, we had a guy that raced at our track. His name was Bill Miller. He had the fastest 101 in the country. And so he goes out there, qualifies second to this girl from California with this weird looking engine. It was a B-bomb, and her name was Linda Emick. And the only time and Bill finished second that weekend at the Nationals. The only time he saw her was at the start. Green flag. And it wasn't just because she was fast, the girl could drive, So, I mean, those are some of the things that, and I'd love to get Ron on here to tell that story sometime, but there's so many great stories. And one of the things that I like about the history of karting is for so many years, it was IKF and WK, and you could tell stories about one or the other, and not to take anything away from these drivers, like Ryan Norberg. I mean, the guys could drive anything. Okay. But there's so many series, Stars, USPKS, SCUSA, it's just Rotax, um, back then it was IKF and WK, and there was some crossover, but if you won one or the other, that was a big deal, because if you were in the East Coast and you won the WK Nationals, that was it. You were the guy, whether it was sprint, four cycle, dirt, enduros. If you won it, you were the guy. And it's not that way anymore.
No, it's not. It's so weird how it's morphed. I look at it now in 25 as if all of these series are kind of one long continuous run almost, because it's a lot of the same cast of characters now crossing over. But I would say for sure in the 2010s era, in the last decade, it was super, super segmented and fragmented, and way more where it was you had Rotax guys, and they would run the Florida Winter Tour. They would maybe run the Formula Kart weekend that had the tag class, but they'd run the Rotax engine in it, and then just kind of Florida locals would run. So that was 6 weekends from January to March. They would run the Rotax Nationals. Rotax added the Pan American Challenge at the end, but they also had a summer shootout, like a warm-up race for the Nationals. And then if they were a really, really go-getter karter and wanted an all-out schedule, they'd run Supernats. That would be their 9 races, plus or minus. And then if they were a West Coast cat, they would run the Challenge of the Americas. They would run the SCUSA California Pro Kart Challenge, now just the Pro Kart Challenge, but a regional deal there for 3 to 5 rounds. Andy's Coda series was 3 rounds. And then you would run maybe Pro Tour, kind of mixing in either the Pro Kart Challenge or Coda. But the Pro Tour would only be 2 rounds. And the third round of the Pro Tour was the Supernats. So you had your 8 or 9 races for your West Coast. And this is West Coast being a Southwest guy, because the Pacific Northwest is a whole different can of worms. And then you have your East Coast to kind of Midwestern group that would run USPKS and WK. Maybe they'd run Supernats. And so Supernats, for my era growing up 10, 15 years ago, was the only coming together that we would halfway see. And it would also end up being a bit of a hodgepodge of a ton of international people. And at that time in the 2000s and 2010s, we'd spent so much time kind of, I wouldn't say falling behind, but doing our own thing with slower classes and stuff that made more sense for our more regionalized markets, that when we would go and run shifter or tag classes and 125 classes, the international kids that would come to Supernats would smoke everyone here in the U.S. And now that's not so much the case. Everything here is stepped up in a very quick manner to the level that the European international scene is, for better or for worse, like we talked about earlier. But I'd love to go back too. I think we'd be totally remiss on this opening episode to get your narration of the IKF WK split, because that's right in your backyard. Is the plaque still up? It's in one of the turns at Camden, right, where it says right here,
Yeah.
with this group of 6 or 8 or 10 people, this is where WK was founded. So take me to that story, because at one time in the US, as hard as it is probably for some of our new age viewers to believe, there was one sanctioning body for karting with IKF. And then in, I guess that would be what, 73? It all changed?
No, 71.
71.
Mm-hmm.
1971. It splits. First ever, our second ever sanctioning body splits off. So what happens?
Well, keep in mind, I was a kid racing back then, so I tried to stay out of all that. But there were some technical issues. There was a couple of on-track incidents that kind of pushed a few people over the edge. But you have to step back a couple years prior to that. And when I tell this story, I always preface it by saying, I'm not really sure if this was the case or not, but it was the perception. And sometimes perception is stronger than truth if you really start getting taken into it. The perception by some people on the East Coast that carry some influence, like Dick Wilson, Ben Ray Griffith, my dad, was IKF didn't care about them. They had a board of directors that were primarily West Coast. There was a couple people from the East, but they felt like they didn't get any love, right? And they had reached out a couple of times and weren't happy with the results. And so a couple of things transpired at Camden in 71. And my dad, Dick Wilson, and a few other people got together and said, well, that's it, we're done. We're starting our own organization. And I think a lot of people, you know, everybody's going to start a new organization, right? It's a big undertaking. Who can do it? Well, they had the resources to do it. And more importantly, they had a vision. And the vision was to try to build an organization that would listen more to the Carter. And again, I'm not saying IKF wasn't listening to the Carter, but the perception was they weren't. Okay. So 1971, the World Karting Association is formed, and it was formed through a gathering of the local racers, I believe, at our track to decide on a name. And then Dick Wilson at Barnesville and Ben Ray Griffith, which was a big promoter of Danville, which is now VIR, and the Woodbridge Kart Club. Those two individuals, I always say, in my opinion, had more to do with the success of WK in the early years than anyone, including my dad, because they controlled the two most prominent venues on the East Coast for sprint racing and enduro racing. So Dick Wilson said, I've had it. I'm done. Well, I'm not going to run IKF anymore. Barnesville, which at the time, Barnesville many years would outdraw the IKF Nationals, the IKF Winter Nationals in Barnesville. He said, Barnesville will be a WK race in the spring of 72. Ben Ray Griffith said Danville will be a WK race in the spring of 1972. Barnesville had their race. There was almost 500 entries. Danville had the race, 500 to 600 enduro racers. All WK members, pit pass sales, more public awareness in the karting community. So sponsors are coming to the WK saying, we want to be part of this. And it all just kind of snowballed from there. That's how it started. Within probably 2 to 3 years, membership had outgrown IKF. And there were still pockets. New York and Florida had some IKF, but for the most part, east of the Mississippi, Quincy was always, and I'm really good friends with Terry Trader and Gus, who's passed now, but Quincy, and by the way, Gus was great friends with my dad, but Quincy and the Trader family was kind of the stopping point. They were always IKF, and then, of course, west of there. And then east of there, it was for the most part, WKA. And they coexisted for many years and really still do. I don't really know. I think IKF still has their Grand Nationals.
Yeah, it's kind of in a hollowed shell is probably a bit of a derogatory way to describe it, right? So, but SCUSA, the Kutcher family, they buy IKF, and one of the terms was to make sure that they would try to at least keep the couple of people that were employed by IKF, keep jobs for them for a couple of years to give them time. And obviously WK is in a much different spot now too, with how all of the different East Coast independent series have grown on the sprint side. The dirt side's been in and out, now back in, helping be a stable series over there. But IKF they still do the IKF Grand Nationals every year. The lure of it, of getting a Duffy, just like a Screaming Eagle with the WK Grand Nationals, I think is the main draw. And it was a way for the Kutcher family and SCUSA that had evolved to this overly pro and shifter oriented organization to say, hey, we're since we're involved in importing tires and engines and supporting clubs and now taking an IKF to try and help insure clubs, we're going to keep the Grand Nationals around as our way to work and support the grassroots end. So IKF Grand Nationals classes are mainly 206 classes, K and mini and micro Swift. And so last year they moved it to Texas, but a lot of times it's bounced around California because that's really. And then the years past, there was one or two times it would go up to like Pat's Acres up in the Northwest.
Right.
But it's kind of hovered over there. It still happens every year, but that's about all that there's left too. And I think that was one of between like the IKF and WK and what was again one of the driving forces for me of wanting to do this show and get to talk to people is so much of like this era of like I don't really know, from every bit of research that I've been able to do of what was the path and the journey of IKF from obviously the split in 71, But beyond that, how it was strong, 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 strong. And then through the 90s and the 2000s, there was still a good amount of IKF regions that were healthy. And then how did it get to here? So much of our sports just never been really tracked well. And that's where like even Supernats, for example, we were struggling last year. We wanted to make sure that we had data and listing of at least the winners, not the podium of like every SCUSA Supernationals. And that's only going back 25 years. And even still, had it not been for our buddies at ECAN, David Cole and Rob Howden, we wouldn't know. I mean, and that event at least has a Wikipedia page too. We had just started it this year, but there's so much just like lost to history almost. And thankfully, while you know, it's not too far removed, we can talk to people and get those stories of what's happened. But as someone who's, part of the younger generation, there's so many questions I have from everyone in
Yeah.
all of these different eras, especially even like something as simple as a series split, right? It's so funny the timing of talking about this and having this episode of the WK split off the IKF, right? Because I've had so many conversations with parents and even the series owners and the modern series, Stars,
Yeah.
SCUSA, USPKS, the like, and exactly like how you described it, right? The perception's the reality, whether or not the truth is of you favoring one group or another, or however else. Stars, for example, they learn very quickly, and they're in a lucky spot with how successful the NKA is, that they can do some more long-term plays,
Right. Right.
similar to what we are. They turn down every single karting related, at least karting race team oriented or brand, chassis manufacturer brand sponsor. Because in the first couple of years they did have one, and they realized that whether or not they felt like they were fair in officiating, which again, 9 times out of 10, the officials that work these go-kart races are not the owners of the series. The owners of the series hardly ever get involved, and these officials are weekend warriors that go back to their 9 to 5 on Monday and have
Yeah.
no care or no skin in the game
Right.
with the karting
Right.
politics, right? But
Yeah.
still,
Yeah.
one extra long, 5 minutes longer talking to one team owner versus another team owner can be enough to stir up the pot. And then just the natural coincidences fall, and you line them up in a certain way, and it looks so they've turned down every single sponsor opportunity and turned down probably a good amount of potential revenue out of like going, well, we don't want anyone to think that whether they're under a big tractor trailer tent or a small team or an independent, that there's any potential bias,
Yeah.
and even still on the perception thing, take the politics part out of it. The X30 classes have been up and down because between Ryan Norberg, as you mentioned, and Mike Rollison and the fantastic powerhouse that they've built, it's daunting to the point where people have, for the first time ever I've seen in motorsports, like lost hope at points throughout the years and
Yeah.
going,
Yeah.
I cannot beat them,
Yeah.
and whether, those that'll get frustrated and claim foul play, or just say, you know what, I don't care if they're legal or not. I can't beat them. I don't want to keep trying to beat them and lose. I'm going to go do something else, and whether or
Yeah.
not it's possible. Now, this year, for example, at the winter series for SCUSA, rather than opening up KA senior, they said, you know what, we still have slots in our X30 senior class. And it by happenstance ended up having a couple of KA guys that probably could have moved up but didn't, get forced into it, and then have their eyes open. Well, we actually were more competitive than we thought. We were closer than what we thought. The rest of the field was closer than what they thought. I mean, Joe Turney swept the whole winter series. He doesn't drive for RPG. Now, he's a world-class talent, but there were plenty of other drivers that led laps
Mm-hmm.
too. Um, but the perception for a long time, until they were forced to drink from that water fountain, was I'm not going to beat him, and then what do you know? The perception wasn't exactly the reality, at least in the case of, that winter series. And since then, the numbers in that class have been better. So that's like another, modern case scenario of a class
That's
that's gone up and down, but
yeah.
off the perception. And I was always curious, has there ever been anything similar in the past? Someone
Yeah.
dominating something to the point that they were so good that it was too good, and then ended up being a bad thing,
Well, and it kills it over the years. It can kill a class.
Yeah.
because and it's not that they're cheating, they just have it figured out. They've got a great driver, they have the setup, and sometimes it's the little things, that they've figured out and they know work. But looping back to the IKF WK thing for a moment, I do want to tell you that one of the significant differences between IKF and WK, and I'm not saying one was better than the other, it was just a different way of doing things. With the WK, my dad was president for 20 years. I was president for 13. Since that time, there have been a few different presidents. With IKF, the president changed quite often. So what would happen is, and I'm not saying that all the presidents of IKF didn't have great ideas, but sometimes when they came on board, they wanted to go left, and the whole time they've been going right, or they wanted to go right, and the whole time they've been going left. So what you do is you're flat. And like my dad or not, or like me or not, we always try to have a direction. But to the year my dad passed away, he had a pretty good working relationship with a lot of the people at IKF. My dad and Gus Trader were great friends. Brad Kenyon was the president of IKF when my dad died. My dad and Brad were great friends. I was great friends with Brad Kenyon. Brad Kenyon came to Ohio to meet me and my dad, and we had lunch one day. And we just had a great conversation together with the help of Neil Keller, which is a former WK officer and one of the longest reigning tech officials WK had. They formed something called the North American Tech Committee, and it was one rule book for IKF and WK. And that went on for a few years. And then again, differences of opinion, and it got split up again. So there was always an effort to try to work together with those things. But I think it's human nature. When you get tired of seeing the rear bumper of somebody week in and week out, and when you're spending a bunch of money, you either, what's the old saying? He's cheating. How do you know he's cheating? Because I'm cheating and he's beating me.
Yeah.
Yeah, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And too, like, part of what I think makes it so tough to have a uniform rule set for this country, or uniform like class set, is how different the US, not only how spaced out the US is, but how different each region is. To someone living in New York City, or in most parts of California now, the the percentage of their probably income to race 206 compared to what it is to race K or shifter, for those that usually have the available time, it's a much different percentage
Right.
than someone living in Ohio, or someone living in rural Georgia or
Absolutely.
Alabama.
Yeah.
Just the average median income and average cost of living is so different. Over there, there's still a good amount of 206, and now Tillotson with their four-stroke kind of equivalent spec class in California, but nothing to the degree of the Midwest, where it's every single club is
Right.
206 heavy, and maybe some Ks and maybe some mini Swifts and micro Swifts, or something of the like, and then Kid
Mm-hmm.
Kart. Um, there's a good amount of shifters. For Mark Oldhafer with his Gear Up F series, that was like the New York City traveling club series. Just it was
Mm-hmm.
never titled that way, but that's where a lot of those guys came
Mm-hmm.
from. They for them, the plane ticket to go down to race at Trackhouse Motorplex in Mooresville, North Carolina, from New York, was not much different from the time and expense commitment it would have been to get them out of New York City over to Tim Hannon's place at OVRP,
Mm-hmm.
or 6 hours down the road over to New Jersey Motorsports Park. At that point, it's like, well, we're gonna probably get on a plane or have to rent a car or go somewhere. So if we're gonna do that, let's go even further. There's already a
Mm-hmm.
full
Yeah.
weekend commitment.
Right.
And from the outside, the F series is like, oh, it's a national traveling series. But then you look and it's no, it's these. This is all these guys do. And if there was a go kart track in the middle of Manhattan, they'd be racing that. But there isn't. So this is what they do instead. Or even with, that's what's so exciting about like K1 circuit, and now with Spring Mountain having a go kart track that in Vegas, but especially K1 because of the market being so close to LA. People talk about the West being big, and then the last decade or so, the whole Western karting sphere has been smaller. A lot of that was fueled by the Southern California market, because people from there would be natural to fly. SCUSA did a home race at Cal Speed, and their entries were lower than the previous year, racing all the way far from headquarters in New Orleans, because all their local customers were already accustomed to flying and traveling across the country to go to races. So I think that makes it hard, and just the natural distance too, to enforce and keep everyone on the same page. I mean, I can only imagine how much more difficult it was before the age of the internet, before the age of social media, to try
Yeah.
to keep everyone in sync and in uniform. I mean, what was
Well,
that? That's a great
well,
question, actually. What was that even like in 1970s, 1980s, 1990s?
well, the example I give is, you've heard about the stadium races back in the day in Daytona. And
Yeah,
we would literally have over 2,000 entries, probably 700 to 800 drivers and over 2,000 entries to race this dirt track, quarter-mile dirt track, municipal stadium.
right.
No computers. This is in the 80s, okay? We had about 4 girls with this.
Yeah.
That's all they had, right? Scored, and we're talking about 10, 12-second, 13-second laps. And maybe 15-second. I'll give them that 15-second. And they're scoring 30 cards, okay? And they get in, they compare their notes and figure out a finish. So I used to ask myself, well, how could they get it right all the time? And I realized maybe they didn't get it right, but how could you prove they wasn't right? I mean, unless you actually, after the first 4 or 5, it's a gaggle, right? So
Well,
that's
forget that too, right? I mean, you told me stories. There'd be 200 drivers trying to qualify in. I
yeah.
mean, the odds of what's it? I would imagine the average of the 4 girls hitting the start and the stop on a stopwatch is what your time was in
Well,
qualifying.
we had the electric eye had been around for a long time. So prior to that, so we had the electric eye, and we had
Okay.
um, well, let me think about that. And that's a good question, but it wasn't stopwatches. There was, there was electric eyes that would give a readout, a digital readout, but it was pre-computer. It wasn't like you didn't like download it to a computer. It didn't interface with a laptop.
No,
It
but
would
it
give you
worked
the
the
time.
same as like a transponder with a timing loop, right? I mean,
Somewhat, yes,
I
yeah,
could just, like I can only imagine the outrage, like if we were to tell like a modern karting parent, and they spend all the time and effort and obviously the money now of where it is to go to the Supernats, even to go to Kart Week, and oh yeah, our stopwatch, we had you, at our average at a 12:34,
yeah.
and the time to beat to get into the top 30 was a 12:31, and the parents like, well, no way, that's, how do you know that's exactly 300 slower than, what we
Yeah.
ran, and I mean,
No,
just
they,
yeah.
they called it the electric eye, but it was a light beam,
Okay.
and those were pretty common in back in the 80s,
Mm.
and it would give you some type of a readout. We used to have a hose at our track that was full of air, and when it tripped it, the air would trip the clock, and it would trip it again to stop it, and then you would read a dial, and the dial would tell you 25.83 or whatever, but it wasn't a digital readout. It was just
Yeah.
like a
No, a
clock.
true analog.
Yeah,
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 like,
right. But
that's
that was
wow.
state of the art back then, right?
I mean, it's
So
ingenious, right?
yeah,
But I mean, that just goes like, it goes back on what I'm so excited to dig in more with this show about stuff like, I mean, I can't tell you probably anyone that I could go to and say, hey, do you remember when, you used to have to do the what's it called? The what eye?
the electric eye.
Electric eye.
Yeah,
I would bet there's probably under 25 people if I went to a SCUSA race
you.
right now that would know
Oh
what I'm
yeah,
talking about if I asked them
right.
about the electric eye.
They would think it's something surgical,
Yeah,
a state
you
of the
know,
art eye.
yeah. Or I mean, the concept of an air hose and running over the air hose to trip
Yeah.
and start and stop. That's
So
incredible.
I got it. I know we're probably winding down here, but I got a story for you.
Yeah.
It's Charlotte, mid 80s,
Uh-huh.
and it's raining. It's an enduro,
Okay.
now called road race, but it's enduro. It's raining, standing water all over the infield, but the ovals, it's banked, it's dry. So without thinking, the race officials say, well, you know what? We'll just run on the oval. Great. Everybody gets to race. How do you score it? Now we're not talking about, a 4-cycle running by at 50 mile an hour. We're talking about and back then you could have a Yamaha class with 100 karts in it, and they're running the oval, and they're all
They're running the
drafted.
big oval, no bus
Yeah.
stop, no nothing, no go.
Well, no, because of the rain, they ran the
Because of
oval.
the rain. So they run the
You-
full 1.5 mile quad oval.
Yep. If you were in the middle of the pack, you could throw a chain and not go off the track for 3 laps because you would get pushed the whole way around. I mean, I'm exaggerating, but that's about the truth, right?
No, but that's dude. I mean, these guys. This is like the last Wild Wild West. This is insane. Like going 100+ miles an hour, lay down karts, and it's the oval. I mean, this wouldn't even be thought about in the modern day, like ever. Like this wouldn't even. The racers would revolt. This is crazy.
But I think the road racers have a different mentality because they appreciate the fact they have the venue. But this is a case where we said to them, if you want to race, we got an idea. We don't race in the rain. We're not putting you on the road course. It's not safe. We can run the oval. And everybody said, sign me up, right? So needless to say, the scores go, tell me that again. What are you going to do? And, of course, we tell them, and they go, who's going to score that? Well, you are. We can't score that. Well, do your best. So we run a few races, and I check on the scores, and they're going, we got nothing, Okay, so Ben Ray Griffith, great man, awesome guy, it was the race director. So I'm walking over to Ben Ray, and I was helping out. I don't know if it was the announcer or what I was doing, but I was helping out. I said, Ben, what are we going to do? He says, I got an idea. Last race runs, no official results are posted. I swear to you, this is a true story. He says, come on. He said, bring the microphone with you. So we walk over to the scoring tower, had it down like a first level, which would, you could get probably 20, 30 people in. He said, call all the drivers for Yamaha Heavy to the scoring tower. All the drivers come over. This was genius. He said, okay, fellas, it was kind of tough today. Scoring wasn't easy, but we got to race. Y'all happy with that? Yes, sir. We really appreciate racing. He goes, well, tell me, who won? Well, Xander did. He beat me by 5 kart lengths. Oh, so you finished second? Yeah, I'm Bobby Jones. I finished second. Well, who finished behind Bobby? Well, I did. We had our top 5 in every class without any dispute. Yeah. Now, was it right? I still haven't heard any complaints. So, and they may have declared it a non-points race. I'm not sure. They probably did, but honestly, everybody knew in that league group where they finished, and nobody was going to argue because they knew they were wrong, right? So I would have never thought of that. Ben goes, I got an idea. Let's do this, and we did it, and it worked out fine. Yeah, it was crazy. But you did stuff like that back then. You didn't have transponders. You didn't. You could go out now with 30 karts 5 wide going down the straightaway, and the transponder is going to pick them all up. Not back then. How fast that pencil worked. That's what you're going to have to do.
Well, it's just a different era too, right? Like part of what I think is such a big pressure point for the modern era's races, especially in sprint, but probably the same in road course dirt or in dirt oval karting too. And I think maybe enduro might be the one that doesn't have a whole lot like this, and that's my kid's starbound in car racing, and this is where they start. And so we need every result possible as fast as it happens, because we're going to be the next Kyle Larson, or we're going to be the next Max Verstappen, right? If you're road course racing. And so there's all this extra ramp them up through the ranks, and we're gone. We don't care so much about the camaraderie factor. It's kind of a footnote. We're not going to see these people again. We want to curb stomp these people because we want to put them in our rearview mirror and then move on to the next challenge of F4 or USF juniors at 12 years old or 13, as soon as they'll let us start testing. Or dirt oval is a little bit different because there's more alternate starting points to the NASCAR ladder with quarter midgets and bandoleros and legends. But by the time they get to legends cars, a lot of the same. I was actually having a conversation with a couple of my NASCAR buddies last night about how there's so much similarity and parallel over there. Legends cars, for example, in the 90s started as this concept in the same way that go-karting was conceived in in the 50s and 60s of I want to go racing in a very simple and low cost budget way. Like this is the hobby racers class, and that was what Humpy
Yep.
Wheeler's goal with the Legends car was. He's like, if we could keep the cost under 20 grand for a car for short track racing, the class flourishes. If the cost exceeds 20 grand, then that short track car class starts to fade. And now, from back then, when it was all about privateer, spec motorcycle motor, basic chassis that all came out of the same shop in North Carolina, treaded tires, and then the Bandolero, and then the Thunder Roadster and Thunder cars, to now, Legends cars teams are no different than go-kart teams. There's powerhouses, there's ones that are, building race ready Legends cars and operating like full-fledged cup teams,
Yeah.
and if you're going to win the Legends Nationals, you're going to want to run with X team. Just like if you want to go and win the Super Nationals, you want to run with X team. And all of it on the, well, I got to win as fast as possible. We don't have the time to sit and wait and develop and enjoy it. And,
Yeah.
because we need to get into a late model at 14, or we need to get into an open
Well,
wheel car at
and
13.
I don't know his exact age, but Keelan Harvick's running the cars late model tour right now,
Yeah.
and he can't be 12 or 13 at the most, I would think.
And he's not alone. There's a lot of
Yeah.
kids now that even too, they were talking with Legends cars, which honestly I think might be a good thing for them. Across the board, there's 10-year-olds, 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds running late models and just bypassing Legends altogether.
Yeah.
And it might not be the worst thing in the world as much as it'll hurt, because the industry's gravitated towards that like fast moving, high dollar, upper end client. If it kind of settles back down, it might go back to the original way that Humpy thought it could be. And the karting that you talk about from the era pre 2000, where it wasn't about, this is where every IndyCar and F1 driver starts, so we're going to go and do this. It was, this was what
We
we do.
well, and we had stars, and not saying there's not stars now. And I think you've revived that aspect of our sport. Okay, you've brought personalities back into karting through Kart Chaser, and that's needed. These guys work their butts off, and I always use Ryan Norberg because Ryan Norberg is a kart racer. He's a very good one, and maybe that's the only thing he's going to do. I don't know, but he's really good at it. He deserves to be considered to be a star. Okay, when it comes to karting, he's a star. We had stars back then, and they weren't always 15 years old. The fellow that raced Haddock, Ken Burden, I told you about, when Ken quit C Open, he was probably in his late 40s, early 50s, and it was time to quit. But guys just race karts. Now, that's not to say there wasn't a Jason Keller that come out of the Gold Cup that went into Grand National Racing. Um, the Denny Hamlin raced dirt go-karts in Virginia back in the day. The Sadler brothers. Um, there was a lot of racers back then that stayed, but you had a few that moved up. But it seems like now it's just, I hate to say it, I always call it back in my day, it was the Jeff Gordon syndrome. But him and Tony Stewart, Jeff and Tony Stewart kind of started because they were so young and they came up and they were so good, right? And I think a lot of little league moms and dads said, you know what? I think I got an idea. I think little Jimmy can be the next one,
Yeah, I mean, I've done a part of, before I started this, is I did a lot of studying on what made sports go and what made sports not go. Professional sports, as well as, in the youth sports realm and the youth sports travel ball industry, right? I mean,
Oh, jeez.
I can only imagine what it was like even for your kids, much less, your grandkids, of who they're going up against for the starting roster spots on the high school football team and what those kids did to get there, much less to get into college. And at least in that case, they're justifying it off of, well, if we pay for this camp, if we go to this travel team, if we do this tryout and we do this tournament, we do this, spend all this money, well, it's going to pay off. At least we're going to get a college scholarship. Now, they're probably going to outspend what they could have to go to that kind of college on that point, but it's the journey, right? And the same way with this, I think a lot of parents are like, well, being realistic, the odds of us making it are very slim, but we're going to still, the ones that I seem, to have a level head about themselves are like, we're going to enjoy it. We're going to give ourselves a shot. We're also not going to bank on that shot. We're going to be like, if this is what we do, this is okay. But I wanted to know if you look back as someone who's been able to see so much of the sport and the evolution of it, is there a time period where that shift or that transition seems to start? Because if I look from the outside, from articles and videos, it seems to me around the 90s and it's because at that time, Ayrton Senna's getting into, the heyday of F1, right, in the late 80s, early 90s, and talking up karting and in a very, very positive light, but shining almost too bright of a light on it. I don't know if that's not even the right terminology, but he's talking about it in such a good way. And then everyone goes,
Yeah.
I want to be him, right?
Well, and I think Scott Pruitt in the U.S. side of things, he's all he did was karting, right? And he came up through, and he didn't come through with a lot of money. They certainly paid their way to a certain point, but his ability got him a lot of where he ended up. I had the chance to do a podcast a couple years ago with Michael McDowell after he won the Daytona 500. And Michael was a junior racer back on our old constructor series. And I got to know Michael and his family fairly well. And we talked about his racing in the constructor series. He says, you have to understand, the year that I won the constructor series as a junior, we were broke. As a family, we had spent all the money we could spend. I wasn't going to be able to race again. And he talks about Charlie Pastorio of Grand Products. He says, my brother and I went to Charlie and said, can you help us? He said, I'll tell you what I'll do. He says, if you guys can get the motors, I'll give you the chassis. At the end of the year, you sell the chassis, whatever you make on it, we'll put it towards whatever you're going to do next year. I'll keep feeding you chassis. He said, that kept us going and allowed me to improve on my career. That, those are the stories. I'm not so sure you hear as many of those anymore because, they kind of get pushed aside a little bit because, and I'm not name names, but look at Formula One. There's some drivers in Formula One that probably shouldn't be in Formula One. Is that fair?
I think so. I mean, I think there's still a good amount of karting stories like that. And if anything, I wouldn't say it happens more, but it definitely doesn't happen less because there's bigger margins and opportunities, right? Like Ryan Norberg, for example. Ryan Norberg, and along with him, Joe Turney and his recent agreement, Marion Kremers' recent Tony Kart contract, and a number of these guys that are paid professional go-kart drivers are at a much higher salary, and just the fact they have a salary, going to
Right.
the Adkins and the Haddocks of the day, that comes from these high dollar Lance Stroll esque clients coming through, and Lance is still a very good driver. There's a lot of drivers that aren't good with the same
Sure.
opportunities and so on. So I think I wouldn't say that a Michael McDowell wouldn't make it in the state because you still have to break through the ceiling and get a result to kind of get into that light, or at least be able to stick it around long enough to where you turn 16 and you can start working. In my case, right? Like I always kept this, but this is zoomed in, so you can't see. But this is the nose cone from my last season I did in X30 Senior in 2019. And season is a loose term. We did I did 4 races, 3 with Darren, Darren's old shop. He had already sold it, and we were both working down at Homestead at the time. I didn't have to spend a dollar because, or at least very minimal by the end of the year, because it was a team funded front. I helped organize, traded my time for dollars, right? I was the driver coach and data analyst. And in turn, that was able to cover the cost of tires and entry fees. And then I would just room with one of the families under the tent for that weekend. And that's how a lot of those deals are now. So you see a lot of that now. It's just to get to the point where I was is an example of being around in the sport long enough where you can work in it and you build relationships, and enough to the point where people are so gracious to go, hey, yes, I'll help you out because I can. I see your hard work. I see how much you help me, or I see how much you help my kid. So if I can upgrade my room where you could sleep on the pull-out couch, like, you got it. If I've got a spare go-kart or spare engine and all you need to buy is your entry fee or your tires, like, I got you. And you're not, so that there's room for stuff like that. I think almost more so now. But the idea of going to a national race and pulling all the drivers together and going, who won? Who finished second and who finished third.
Well, you
That
watched the
level,
video.
well, yeah, you watch the video, obviously, but protests and I mean
I
these
know.
different series partly exist because they get mad at one. The series takes the blame for something that just happened, but the customers are so adamant and so competitive
Yeah.
that I feel like I remember talking with Eric Jones about this. You know, right now in our sport, in my opinion, we have a bit of a blocking epidemic. And it's funny the timing of this. I don't know exactly when we'll get this episode out, right? But I mean, blocking is per the rule books now reactionary. Technically, what I'm talking about is the defending or defensive driving, the proactive movements, where I get in front, and I know that in most cases you got to push back bumpers, so you're probably not going to hit me that hard. But even if you don't, I'm just going to hit the brakes even harder, and I'm going to park it on the inside of the corner every single lap. And you gotta hit me, you gotta crash me, or maybe hope that I screw up and you cross me over. But the odds of that are so rare with the grip of the modern soft tire, the grip of the modern go karts, and the weight of them, right? And talking with Eric, there was one time I was talking with him about it after we were watching a national race. And he's like, dude, he's like, you would never believe this, but in the 90s, when I was racing these street circuit go-kart races, there would be guys to the last lap, last corner, leading the race, a money race, and wouldn't block, and they would get passed. And that would just be what happened. He's like, they wouldn't be mad. They just, blocking didn't happen. Defending your position just didn't happen back then. And another person I was talking to was also bringing up some good points about how mostly running spec classes, the evolution of karting engines and equipment that it doesn't break nearly as often as back in the day. Um, and the added seat time for everybody, the fields, the times are closer and more karts finish at the end of a race. So you have more people near each other. It's very similar to the problems NASCAR is experiencing now with the next gen cars, where the lap times are 2/10 from first to last in a field. And basically the difference is whether you're a mean guy and rough someone up or not. It's less about disparity. But it's just, I guess, going all the way back, it's hard to fathom for me a less competitive, more camaraderie, top level event atmosphere. And I feel like part of that comes from this push to go to car racing.
Well, I think too, when you look, back in the day, back when I raced, so to speak, if you block somebody, the next quarter you might wind up on your head because you didn't, you pretty much have a full body car right now for all practical purposes. We didn't have that back then. And if you got under somebody and hooked a wheel and they came down on you, chances are the guy that's leading is going to go on his head. Okay. So you had to be careful. You're blocking somebody because if they can dive a corner and knock you right off the track. Whereas now it's kind of like a side swipe. And yeah, maybe if you hit them hard enough, they'll get out of there, but the consequences aren't as great. Back then, when you block somebody, it may not be the smartest thing you should do. So, you could get creative a little bit and do a lazy line left to right or something on a long straightaway to set up and make it a little harder. But if you start blocking him back and forth, he's going to give you the bumper or he's going to sneak underneath you and give you a wheel. And back then, if that happened, you probably weren't going to win the race. You may not even finish the race.
Yeah. Yeah, that part too, right? Like people talk about respect from back in the day, and I think respect is such a funny word to use because you could race direct a major go-kart race in 1970, 1980, and almost 1990 with one guy from the head flag stand. And then, I see the comments and hear the comments like, oh, just get the black flag out and start flagging guys off, um, because the danger did most of the work for you, right? That was more of the respect. The drivers, I feel like, talk to each other more now than they ever have, with all the media we force them to do together and how many events the same traveling circus meets up, meeting
Mm-hmm.
up for a couple of nationals
Right.
a year is not the case anymore. Ryan Norberg and Austin Garrison, they see each other every other week. They're on track with each other 12 to 15 times a year. In a way, it's a good thing because that growth period for some of the young kids moving up as a rookie, they actually have that same kind of talk from some of the veterans of the classes. Was talking with Paulie Massimino about this last week. He was talking about one rookie. He's like, look, man, there's times we point each other by when it's not our day because we know we're going to race that same guy in 2 weeks
Mm-hmm.
or next week.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're going to keep just running everybody so rough for 8th and 9th and 10th, you're never going to finish these races.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And he's like, it may not be me. I'm not threatening you. I'm just saying, like, we all race the same crowd of guys for the win year in, year out now for 10, 12, 15 weekends a year. So it's different. But back then, there wasn't that. There
No.
just was the fear of, well, the guy behind me might just miss his braking zone. And instead of giving me a little love tap, he's going to ramp over my rear tires and I'm going to take a tire to the helmet. And I think, yeah, the respect was the fear of you getting hurt selfishly,
Well,
and probably a little bit of camaraderie for your fellow competitor too. But
but keep in mind, back when there was just one Grand Nationals, a lot of the guys you were racing with, you may not even know.
yeah, that's what I
I
mean.
mean,
Like when
yeah,
they say respect, it wasn't like I like Randy. I'm not gonna, drive into Randy or send Randy on his head. It's no, I'm worried I'm gonna go on my head if I try to
right,
put Randy on his head. We're both
right,
going on our heads,
right,
right?
exactly, yeah, yeah,
So because of that, it was very easy to race direct because most of the incidences were like self-policing, and it would only be rare instances that the head flagman would need to get involved, probably. And I'm assuming, obviously, I wasn't born then at most of those cases. So, but that's when people talk about stuff like that. That there's some stuff that the crossover isn't there. But I think the takeaway is like having those real conversations of here's why we raced the way that we did. Here's how we were able to get away with what we were able to get away with then. And we may not be able to have that exact same scenario now with all of the evolution of life and what we can and can't get away
mm-hmm.
with insurance and everything else.
Right,
But to me, understanding why things worked and why some things didn't work from back in the day, there still is the crossover, right? And so, like, Lynn always puts it so good. He's like, look, Xander, if we went to jail for speeding, would you go 5 over? He's like, even if there were 10 of us going 5 over, if the odds are you're 1 out of 10% chance you go to jail, are you going to speed? No. He's like, but if you only get a $250 ticket, if you are one of the one sucker out of the 10 of us that gets pulled over for speeding, probably going to speed, right?
yeah,
It's that fear, the fear of
the
God, the fear of
consequence.
consequence
Yep,
needs to be
yep,
strong enough to
mm-hmm.
deter guys from bad moves. And if the fear's big enough, uh, you can have that clean racing with maybe less intervention and nitpicking and not a laundry list, full separate white sheet of small penalties at the end of the day. You have 3. This guy got DQ'd. This guy got DQ'd. This guy got DQ'd. And the guys that got DQ'd thrown out for the weekend, well, they're probably never going to do that move again. They got them thrown out because their weekend's over.
Yeah, and back in the WK days, a lot of guys chase points, and that national championship at the end meant a lot. So it's one thing if they got black flagged to race, but if they went over the line, they could get suspended, which would kill their whole season. So we tried to put enough teeth into it that we didn't do it too much. But if somebody really got offline, there was a consequence. And I think to some extent, I know I remember a particular situation in Charlotte where this kid just took the other driver out. Just it was awful. And he got out of the cart. The race was over, and he got out of the cart, and he's walking towards the other driver. And I stepped in front of him. I says, "Don't do this." I said, "We're going to take care of it, but if you do this, then you become part of the problem." And and he calmed down. But there has to be some teeth into it. In my opinion, it can't just be $100. It can't be $200. It's got to be. It stopped me from it's going to whatever the consequence is going to stand in the way of me accomplishing what I want to accomplish to the point that my season could be over if I really screw up bad enough. That's the consequence in order for somebody to really, unless they just go overboard and don't think at all, which happens sometimes too.
Well, Randy, this has been so fun for me. I'm so excited at what we're going to get to do with this show, to talk about club karting, the history of karting, to bring on some people that are going to have some. I mean, you yourself have so many more war stories. You and I could go on this for a long time, but there's some legends you and I both know
Yeah.
are excited to talk about. So, as we come to a close with episode 1, first of all, thank you for going on this journey with me. I'm
Yeah.
stoked to get to more
I'm too.
guys, but yeah, closing thoughts, I guess, on what you would love to see out of this episode. What can viewers expect for you to bring and for us to bring together?
Well, history is important. If you want to understand where you are in life and where you're headed, it's important to know where you've been, right? And that's why I think no matter what type of karting you're in, at what level, knowing the history and how it evolved will help you understand what you're doing today and where you are. So I think if we can accomplish that, and at the same time, if we can give some gratification and some knowledge to those club racers and the clubs themselves and the track owners to kind of share the knowledge with some of these successful track owners, I mean, I think I believe that's a void right now in our sport that we need to fill. And I just love talking to some of these guys, the Haddocks, the Terry Trader's another one. I've talked to Terry quite a bit.
Yeah, we need to get him on.
Terry's, yeah, we can definitely get him on. There's so many that, I talked to Lake Speed in a podcast a couple
Yeah.
years ago, and I talked to Lynn, and they both tell us a version of the World Championship year. What we have to do is get them on together.
Yeah, we need
So
to
that,
set that one straight because I've
yeah,
asked Lynn about it, and it's the first 3 episodes. I split it up, and a big part of, I think it was episode 2 on my little 3-parter with Lynn, was their world championship story. It's really a 2-year journey,
yeah,
right? It's really 2 years of the year before where they raced together, the next year where Lynn wrenched for him and Lake ended up winning the whole thing,
yeah,
and how they got there and how it all yeah, just a classic um no every other scenario, every other parallel universe, Lake
right.
Speed's not a world champion,
That's right.
right? And Lynn's not a world championship tuner. But in this specific universe, the
Yeah,
way everything fell, it works out. And yeah, they both, the little I've talked to Lake about it, but in the full recording I have with Lynn, it's not exactly the same.
no. And one of the funniest things Lynn told me about that whole story was that they didn't have a cart stand, so they had this trash can that
Yes.
they had the cart on.
There's a picture of it. Lynn showed me the
Yeah,
picture of it on the trash can.
he
It's
said
incredible.
he said, Randy, I swear to you, I went back, however, what it would have been 30 years later, they went to Le Mans. He said, Randy, I swear to you, that trash can is still there. So yeah, there's a ton of stories like that'll be fun to hear and learn about. But at the same time, I think it kind of gives you an idea about the evolution of karting and where it's been. And like the tire story at Barnesville, that was the transition, so to speak, of, oh, tires make me go faster. Geez, what's out there? What can I do? Chassis, the European chassis invasion, so to speak, where there were so many U.S. manufacturers, and all of a sudden there's not too many. Margate's got the Ignite program, which is solid and going well, which is another grassroots story that is very successful. Is the Margate Ignite story, but yeah, there's a lot of it out there, and a lot of it I think we can uncover and share, and hopefully people enjoy to hear.
Yeah, I hope so. I know at least I will. I'm so excited to go on this ride, and I hope you guys all are too. So for Randy and myself, it's the end of episode 1. And for every episode here on out, we're gonna have hopefully a legend of the sport, either from karting's past, present, or maybe some of the legends of the future joining us. So thanks for
Yep.
listening. Thanks for watching. We'll see you guys on the next one.